Okay, so you want to know about psychology, right? You want to dive deep, but you don't have all the time in the world to become a full-blown expert.
Yeah, and you don't want to wade through like a ton of textbooks and journal articles just to get the basics.
Exactly. So that's where this deep dive comes in. We've gone through a mountain of information, honestly, like seriously, tons of it. And we've pulled out what we think are like the most important nuggets, the most surprising connections to kind of give you a real solid understanding.
Yeah, think of it like this is your express lane to grasping what psychology is really all about. We're going to be talking about what it even means to study the mind scientifically, where this whole field even came from, and all the twists and turns it took to get where it is today.
And in all the different ways that people think about the mind and behavior, because it's not just one thing. Right?
No, at all. It's a whole bunch of different schools of thought, and they're all kind of vying for attention and trying to explain what makes us tick.
And then we're going to see how all this stuff actually gets applied in everyday life, in clinics and schools, workplaces, you name it.
And we'll touch on some of the big controversies and debates that are happening right now in psychology, because it's a field that's constantly evolving and questioning itself.
All right, so let's get started with like the most basic question. What is psychology? When you get down to it, what is it actually trying to understand?
Okay, so the simplest definition is it's the scientific study of mind and behavior.
Mind and behavior.
Right. So it's about connecting those inner experiences, the thoughts, the feelings that we have with our outward actions, and it's trying to do this systematically.
So it's not just like guessing or intuiting what's going on. It's like using the tools of science.
Exactly. So it's not just folk psychology, like our everyday kind of common sense explanations for why people do the things they do.
Right.
It's about developing theories, testing those theories with data, and then refining those theories based on the evidence.
And this isn't just about human behavior, right? I mean, psychologists study animals too.
Oh, yeah, for sure. I mean, they study everything from, rats and pigeons to chimpanzees and dolphins.
Wow.
Because, studying animals can give us clues about the basic building blocks of behavior and how those building blocks have evolved over time.
I see. And speaking of kind of the foundations of psychology, it really does seem to sit between like different ways of looking at the world, right? Like it's not just biology, it's not just sociology, it's kind of in between.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. It's very interdisciplinary. So you've got biological psychologists who are, really interested in the brain, the nervous system, the hormones, and how all of that influences our thoughts and our feelings and our behaviors.
So that's like the neuroscience connection.
Exactly. And then on the other hand, you've got social psychologists who are looking at how we behave in groups, how those social dynamics shape us, how we're influenced by other people.
That's where the sociology comes in.
Yeah, exactly. And then, of course, you have all these other areas in between, developmental psychology, personality psychology, cognitive psychology.
So who are the people doing all this work? Like, who are the psychologists?
Well, you've got a real mix. Some psychologists are primarily practitioners, so they work directly with individuals or groups to help them, cope with problems and improve their mental health.
So like therapists, counselors?
Exactly. And then you have researchers who are doing studies, trying to really push the boundaries of what we know about the mind and behavior.
Working in universities' labs.
Yeah, and you'll also hear some people referred to as behavioral scientists or cognitive scientists. They often focus on those fundamental processes of how we learn, how we remember, how we think.
Okay, so we've got practitioners, we've got researchers, and the stuff they study covers a massive range, right?
It does. It's really quite vast.
Like, give me some examples.
Well, I mean, think about how we take in information from the world through our senses. That's perception. Then you've got cognition, which is all about those thinking processes, our reasoning, our problem solving, our decision making. And then, of course, our emotions, our feelings, how we regulate them, how they influence our behavior.
Yeah.
Intelligence, how do we measure it? And then you have those really subjective personal experiences, that sense of self that we all have.
Right.
And then motivation, what drives us, what gets us out of bed in the morning, what makes us pursue our goals. And then, of course, the brain, the incredible organ that underlies all of this.
Yeah. Personality,
our relationships with others. And then we have things like psychological resilience. How do people cope with stress and adversity?
Right.
Family resilience. How do families stay strong and healthy in the face of challenges? And even the unconscious mind. Those thoughts, feelings, and motivations that we're not even aware of.
So it's like there's this whole world happening under the surface.
Exactly. And that's one of the things that makes psychology so fascinating.
It's interesting to me how you have this really scientific approach in research, right?
Yeah.
Trying to find cause and effect. And then in therapy, there's more of an emphasis on understanding the individual's experience. Right?
Yeah, that's a really good point. In research, psychologists are often using what we call empirical methods.
Empirical methods.
Yeah, so that's basically systematic observation and experimentation.
Okay.
So they're trying to identify patterns and relationships between variables, and they're trying to figure out, what causes what.
Right.
But then in clinical and counseling settings, it's more about understanding the individual's unique perspective, the personal meaning they're making of their experiences.
And more subjective.
Yeah, exactly.
So what's the big picture goal here? What is psychology ultimately trying to achieve?
Well, a big part of it is to understand and treat mental health issues.
Right, that makes sense.
But it's broader than that. It's also about, using our knowledge of the human mind to solve problems in all sorts of areas of human endeavor. Whether it's improving education, making workplaces more effective, understanding social issues.
So it's about applying this knowledge.
Exactly. And
Yeah.
ultimately the goal for many psychologists is to use their findings to benefit society.
And we see psychologists working in so many different roles these days.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
It's not just, the stereotypical image of the therapist on the couch.
Right. That's just one small part of it.
Yeah.
So yeah, many do work in those therapeutic roles, as clinical psychologists in hospitals, counseling, psychologists in private practice school, psychologists, helping students.
But there's so many others.
Yeah, you have a ton involved in research, at universities and other institutions.
Mm-hmm.
And then you've got industrial and organizational psychologists who are applying psychology to the workplace.
So like helping with hiring and teamwork and things like that.
Exactly. And then you've got developmental psychologists who are studying how people change across the lifespan. Psychologists who focus on aging psychologists who work with athletes, to enhance performance.
Wow.
Health psychologists, forensic psychologists, educational psychologists, media psychologists. I mean, the list goes on and on.
So this field really has expanded.
It has. It's really exploded in the past century or so.
All right. So we've got a good sense of what psychology is now,
Yeah.
but it didn't just like appear out of nowhere.
Right.
Well,
Not at all.
Like where did it all begin? What are the historical roots?
Okay, well, let's start with the word itself, psychology. It
Okay.
comes from the Greek words psyche, which originally meant spirit or soul, and logia, meaning the study of.
So the study of the soul, that sounds very philosophical.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. The concept of the soul or spirit was central to those early discussions about the mind. And actually, the term psychology in its current form didn't really appear until the Renaissance. The Latin version, psychologia, was first used by a Croatian scholar named Marko Marulic in a book he wrote sometime between 1510 and 1520.
So even way back then, they were thinking about, the nature of the soul.
Yeah, and the first known use of the word in English was in 1694.
Okay.
It was in a dictionary by Stephen Blanchard. And he defined it as, the study of the soul, contrasting it with anatomy, which was the study of the body.
So it was already being seen as a separate field of study.
Yeah, and you've probably seen the Greek letter Ci.
C.
Yeah, it's also used as a symbol for psychology because it's the first letter of psyche.
Okay, I see. It's funny to think about how we use that term psychology today in a professional sense versus, just our everyday kind of folk psychology, like you were saying.
Yeah, and that's an important distinction. Folk psychology is our intuitive understanding of people's thoughts and feelings and behaviors.
Right. It's like common sense.
Yeah, and it's based on our everyday experience, but professional psychology relies on systematic observation research, formal theories, and it tries to go beyond just those kind of everyday explanations.
So even before like the word psychology was around, people were still thinking about these big questions.
Oh, yeah, totally. Ancient civilizations all over the globe had rich philosophical traditions that grappled with the questions about the nature of the mind. What is consciousness? What is thought? How do we perceive the world?
So where do we see these early ideas?
Well, in ancient Egypt, for example, the Ebers Papyrus, which is a medical text that's like from 1550 BC, mentions things like depression and what seem to be thought disorders.
Wow, so they were already thinking about mental health back then.
Yeah, and the ancient Greeks were obviously incredibly influential.
Like the Greeks?
Yeah, thinkers like Thales, Plato, and especially Aristotle really delved into how the mind works.
So Aristotle, I mean, he's like the the philosopher, right?
He's a big one, and his work De Anima, which means On the Soul, really explored these questions in depth.
Okay.
And even before Aristotle, the physician Hippocrates, as early as the 4th century BC, he was already suggesting that mental disorders had physical causes, not supernatural ones.
So that was a big shift.
It was a huge shift. And then Plato, he proposed that the brain was the seat of mental processes.
Okay, so Plato was team brain.
Yeah. But Aristotle thought it was the heart.
Oh, so they were still debating that back then.
Yeah, it took a while to settle that one.
And we often focus on the Western traditions, but what about like Eastern philosophy?
Yeah.
What were they saying about the mind?
Oh, that's a great point. You know, Eastern philosophy has a lot to offer as well. So in China, for example, understanding of the mind evolved from the teachings of Laozi, Confucius, and later Buddhist ideas.
Okay.
Their insights came from, introspection, careful observation, and they developed practices aimed at, focusing the mind and cultivating inner purity.
So it's a more introspective approach.
Yeah, and they also saw this strong connection between the physical and the mental realms.
I see.
And the ancient text, the Yellow Emperor's Classic of Internal Medicine, which is a really important text in Chinese medicine, identified the brain as the nexus of wisdom and sensation.
Wow.
They also had theories about personality, based on the concept of yin and yang.
Right, yin and yang.
And they saw mental disorders as arising from imbalances, in bodily functions and social factors.
So they were already thinking about that mind-body connection.
Exactly. And this inquiry continued to develop. Later during the Qing dynasty, you had scholars like Fang Yizi Luzi and Wang Qingren who were aware of some Western learning, and they made significant advances in understanding the brain.
Okay.
Wang Qingren, he emphasized the brain's central role in the nervous system. He linked mental disorders to diseases of the brain. He explored the causes of dreams and insomnia. And he even proposed an early theory of hemispheric lateralization.
Hemispheric lateralization?
Yeah, which is the idea that the two halves of the brain have different functions.
Wow, so they were already thinking about that.
Yeah, pretty remarkable for that time.
So we've talked about ancient Egypt, ancient Greece, ancient China. What about like the Enlightenment in Europe? Did those thinkers contribute to what would become psychology?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, in Germany, you had Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, who was a philosopher and mathematician.
Okay.
And he applied his ideas about calculus to the workings of the mind.
Wow. Calculus in the mind.
Yeah, he suggested that mental activity existed on a continuum, and that the difference between conscious and unconscious awareness was just a matter of degree.
Okay, that's an interesting idea.
And then Christian Wolff, he actually identified psychology as a distinct scientific discipline in the 1730s.
Wow, so that's when it really started to become its own thing.
Yeah, he wrote these important works on empirical and rational psychology. And then Immanuel Kant, he viewed psychology as a branch of anthropology.
Anthropology.
Yeah, but interestingly, he was kind of skeptical about the possibility of an experimental psychology.
Really?
Yeah, he didn't think that you could study inner experience, using the same kind of rigorous methods as the natural sciences.
So he thought it was more of a philosophical thing. So we have this long history of philosophical exploration, but when did psychology really become the experimental science we know today?
Well, that shift is largely marked by the emergence of experimental psychology in the late 19th century.
The late 19th century.
Yeah, and Wilhelm Wundt is often considered the founder of modern psychology.
Wundt.
Yeah, he established a psychology laboratory in Leipzig, Germany in 1879.
1879.
And this was really a pivotal moment because he was specifically aiming to study the structure of the human mind using systematic experimental methods.
So he wanted to make it a real science.
Exactly. And he often used introspection, where people carefully examine their own conscious thoughts and feelings.
So it's still kind of subjective in a way.
Yeah, in a way. But he was trying to make it as systematic and rigorous as possible.
And Wundt had a lot of students who went on to become influential figures themselves.
Right, yeah, tons of them.
Haiku.
Well, one example is Narendra Nath Sengupta, who established the first psychology department and laboratory in Calcutta, India in 1905.
Wow, so psychology was already spreading around the world at this point.
It was. And then you have others like Walter Dill, Scott Leitner Whitmer, and James McKeen Cattell, who really focused on developing ways to measure mental abilities.
So like intelligence testing.
Yeah, those were the early precursors to intelligence testing.
Okay.
Cattell, who had also studied with Francis Galton, later founded the Psychological Corporation, which became a major player in psychological testing.
The Psychological Corporation.
Yeah, and Whitmer focused on the psychological assessment of children, and Scott Phipps, he applied psychological principles to things like employee selection.
So they were already thinking about practical applications.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
What other big developments were happening in this early phase of experimental psychology?
Well, one important debate was between structuralism and functionalism.
Structuralism and functionalism. Okay.
Yeah, so structuralism, championed by Edward Titchener, another one of Wundt's students, aimed to analyze the mind into its basic elements.
So like breaking it down into its component parts.
Exactly, and they did this mainly through introspection.
Okay.
But then functionalism, which emerged around the same time, emphasized the purpose and the adaptive value of mental processes.
So it's not just about the structure, it's about what it does.
Yeah, how those processes help us to function in our environment.
I see.
And key figures in functionalism were William James, John Dewey, and Harvey Carr.
William James is a big name in psychology.
Huge name. He wrote Principles of Psychology in 1890, which was incredibly influential.
I've heard of that one.
Yeah, it offered a broader view than structuralism, and he famously described consciousness as a stream of consciousness.
Okay.
James's ideas really resonated with a lot of American scholars and students and really helped to draw people into the field.
And John Dewey, he's known for his work in education. Right?
Exactly.
Hey.
He was a big proponent of progressive education, and he really integrated psychological thinking with social concerns. You know, he advocated for the development of moral values in children. And then Harvey Carr, he focused on the Darwinian aspects of functionalism, you know, emphasizing the survival value of different behaviors.
So how did these different schools of thought play out?
Well, functionalism really became the dominant perspective in American psychology, you know, and it laid the groundwork for a lot of the applied areas that we see today.
So it was more practical in a way.
Yeah, it was really about understanding how psychology could be used to solve real-world problems.
I see. So it wasn't just happening in Germany and the U.S., right?
Yeah.
Like other parts of the world were also starting to do their own psychology research.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, in South America, for example, Horacio Ju Pinheiro, he led a significant movement in experimental psychology at the University of Buenos Aires.
Okay, in Argentina.
Yeah, and he was particularly interested in the biological foundations of mental life. And then in Russia, there was also a strong emphasis on the biological basis of psychology.
Okay.
Starting with Ivan Sekhenov, who in the 1870s argued that all behavior could be explained by brain reflexes.
So he was really a materialist.
Yeah, he was, and he advocated a deterministic view of human actions.
Deterministic meaning like we don't have free will.
Exactly. And then, of course, you have Ivan Pavlov, the physiologist who made his groundbreaking discoveries about classical conditioning with dogs.
Right. Pavlov and his dogs.
Yeah, that had a profound impact on the development of psychology as well.
Okay. So as this field was growing, psychologists started to organize themselves, right? We see the beginnings of professional societies and journals and things like that.
Yeah, that's right. You know, one of the earliest societies was La Société de Psychologie Physiologique in France in the 1880s.
Okay, in France.
Yeah, and then the first International Congress of Psychology, which was sponsored by what's now the International Union of Psychological Science, was held in Paris in 1889.
The International Congress of Psychology.
Yeah, and William James was actually one of the attendees.
Wow.
And shortly after that, in 1892, the American Psychological Association was founded.
The APA.
Yeah, the APA and the International Congress continued to be held in various locations, and it became increasingly international over time, even including presentations from scholars outside of Western traditions.
So it was already becoming a global field.
Yeah, and the formation of these societies really marked the professionalization of psychology as a distinct and growing field.
Okay, so moving into the 20th century, I mean, we know that those big global events had a huge impact on so many aspects of life.
Yeah.
How did World War I and the period that followed affect the development of psychology?
Yeah, the impact was really significant, particularly in Germany.
In Germany?
Yeah, following World War I, psychology gained influence through its involvement with the military.
Okay.
And this trend, unfortunately, continued and expanded during the Nazi era.
Oh, right.
Yeah, so under the leadership of Matthias Goering, who was a cousin of Hermann Goering,
Oh, wow.
the Berlin Psychoanalytic Institute was renamed the Goering Institute. And many psychologists faced pressure to align their work with the prevailing political ideology.
So it was a very dark time for psychology.
Yeah, it was a really difficult time. And, you know, after World War II, efforts were made to rebuild and reestablish psychology as an independent and ethical discipline in Germany.
Right, to kind of cleanse it.
Yeah, new institutions were founded, and figures like Alexander Mitscherlich played a vital role. He established an influential journal focused on applied psychoanalysis called Psyche, and he created the first clinical psychosomatic medicine division at Heidelberg University.
So they were trying to bring it back to its roots.
Yeah, and by 1970, psychology had even become a required part of the medical curriculum in Germany.
Wow, so it really regained its standing.
It did.
It's also important to acknowledge that throughout its history, psychology, like many fields, has had its own, biases and limitations.
Yeah, absolutely. As the 20th century progressed, there was a growing awareness of the need for a more inclusive and representative psychology. Recognizing the historical underrepresentation of women in the field, female psychologists in the United States formed the National Council of Women Psychologists in 1941, which later evolved into the International Council of Psychologists.
Okay.
Similarly, organizations like the Association of Black Psychologists and the Asian American Psychological Association emerged to promote the inclusion and address the specific concerns of underrepresented racial and ethnic groups within psychology.
So there was a movement towards greater diversity.
Yeah, and on a broader international level, there was a push for more collaboration and standardization.
Right.
So the International Union of Psychological Science, or IUPCS, was founded in 1951 under the auspices of UNESCO.
UNESCO.
Yeah, and since then, the way psychology is taught and researched in many countries has been influenced by what's often referred to as the Euro-American model.
So that model has really spread around the world.
It has, and the American Psychological Association continued to grow substantially, both in terms of its membership and in the number of specialized divisions it encompassed, reflecting the increasing diversity of interests and expertise within the field.
Okay, so we've covered the historical journey, the emergence of psychology as a science.
Yeah.
Well, let's dive into the major schools of thought that have really shaped how we understand the mind and behavior. Where should we begin?
Well, I think a logical starting point is the biological school of thought.
A biological school.
Yeah, and this perspective really emphasizes the physical foundations of our behavior, our thoughts and feelings.
Okay, so it's all about the brain, the body, the genes.
Yeah, it includes behavioral neuroscience, which looks at the role of the brain, the nervous system, genetics, and other biological factors in shaping what we do. Researchers in this area often use animal models to study basic processes like learning memory and how we respond to fear.
Right.
And we're also seeing these incredible advances in how we can study the human brain directly, with new technologies.
Yeah, like brain imaging.
Exactly. Cognitive neuroscience uses tools like fMRI, which allows us to see, which parts of the brain are more active when we're engaged in different mental tasks.
That's so cool.
It's pretty amazing. And the neuropsychologists, they focus on understanding how brain function relates to our behavior and cognitive abilities, often by studying the effects of brain injuries or neurological conditions.
Well, if someone has a stroke or a brain injury, they can see how that affects their thinking or their behavior.
Exactly. And then the biopsychosocial model takes a broader view, looking at how biological, psychological, and social factors all interact, influence our health and well-being.
So it's not just one or the other, it's all of these things together.
Yeah, it's really emphasizing that holistic perspective. And then there's evolutionary psychology, which proposes that many of our psychological traits and tendencies have evolved over time, to help us adapt to our environment.
So that's the idea that our minds are shaped by evolution. Okay, so that's looking at the physical underpinnings.
Yeah.
What about the behaviorist perspective? What's their main focus?
So behaviorism at its core emphasizes the role of learning in shaping our behavior.
Learning.
Yeah, it focuses on observable actions and the environmental stimuli that trigger them.
Okay.
A key principle is the idea of association. And this led to the discovery of classical conditioning, which was famously demonstrated by Ivan Pavlov.
Right, Pavlov's dogs.
Exactly. He showed how a neutral signal like a bell could become associated with a natural reflex like salivating to food.
So the dogs learned to associate the bell with the food.
Yeah. And in the United States, Edward Lee Thorndike, his work on how consequences influence behavior also paved the way for behaviorism.
Okay.
And then John B. Watson, he's often credited with formally launching the behaviorist movement in 1913.
1913.
He argued that psychology should be a purely objective science, focused on predicting and controlling observable behavior.
So they weren't interested in like those inner thoughts and feelings.
Not really. They were really focused on what you could see and measure.
And Watson's famous and now ethically debated Little Albert experiment is a well-known example of this approach, right?
Yeah, that's a classic example. And behaviorism gained a lot of traction. Figures like Clark L. Hull and Edwin Guthrie further developed its principles. And B.F. Skinner, he introduced the concept of operant conditioning, which highlights how reinforcement and punishment shape our actions.
So like rewarding good behavior and punishing bad behavior.
Exactly. And radical behaviorists like Skinner, they largely avoided discussing internal mental states. They were really focused on that relationship between environmental stimuli and observable responses.
Okay. But behaviorism also faced its own limitations and criticisms, right?
Oh, yeah, for sure. Noam Chomsky's critique of Skinner's attempt to explain language acquisition, in purely behaviorist terms, was very influential.
Chomsky, the linguist.
Yeah, he argued that our ability to use language is far too complex to be simply learned through reinforcement.
Right, we're not just like parrots mimicking what we hear.
Exactly. And Martin Seligman, his research on learned helplessness also showed that there are psychological phenomena that behaviorism couldn't fully account for.
Learned helplessness.
Yeah, that's the idea, that if you repeatedly experience uncontrollable negative events, you can kind of give up and stop trying to escape those situations even when escape is possible.
So it's like a feeling of hopelessness.
Exactly. And even within behaviorism, figures like Edward C. Tolman, they started to incorporate cognitive elements. They suggested that animals could form cognitive maps of their environment.
Okay, so there was a little bit of a shift there.
Yeah, there was some pushback against that really strict behaviorist view.
And so that leads us to the cognitive school of thought. How did that perspective emerge?
Well, cognitive psychology really gained momentum in the mid-20th century, and this is often called the cognitive revolution.
The cognitive revolution.
And it represented a return to studying those internal mental processes, things like perception, attention, memory, language, problem solving.
Those things that behaviorism had kind of ignored.
Exactly. And cognitive psychologists often use an information processing model, drawing analogies between the human mind and computers.
So instead of just focusing on what goes in and what comes out, they were interested in what's happening in between.
Precisely. Those mental processes that mediate between the stimulus and the response.
Okay.
And they built upon earlier work in experimental psychology, but they incorporated new ideas and research methods. Albert Bandura's social learning theory, which emphasized learning through observation and imitation, also played a key role in this shift.
So we can learn by watching others.
Exactly. And groundbreaking work in neuroscience by figures like Charles Sherrington and Donald O. Hebb started to connect these mental processes to brain activity.
So they were starting to see how the brain was involved.
Yeah, and the rise of computer science and artificial intelligence also provided new ways of thinking about how information could be processed.
That makes sense.
So cognitive psychology has really given us a lot of insight into how our thinking can sometimes be biased or lead us astray.
Oh, yeah, like cognitive biases.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The study of cognitive biases, those systematic patterns of deviation from norm or rationality and judgment, has been a major area.
Right. So, like, we tend to overestimate the likelihood of events that are easily recalled, or we jump to conclusions based on limited information.
Sure, exactly. Those kinds of things. And cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT, developed by Albert Ellis and Aaron T. Beck.
CBT, I've heard of that.
Yeah, it's a very influential therapeutic approach that integrates principles from both behaviorism and cognitive psychology.
So it's about changing your thoughts and your behaviors.
Yeah, and on a broader scale, cognitive science emerged as an interdisciplinary field that brings together psychology, neuroscience, linguistics, computer science, and philosophy.
Wow, so it's a real melting pot of disciplines.
It is. It's really trying to understand the mind from all these different angles.
Okay, so another really important perspective is the social school of thought. What does that focus on?
So social psychology examines how our thoughts, feelings, and behaviors are influenced by the presence and actions of other people.
So it's all about how we interact with each other.
Exactly. And it explores topics like conformity persuasion, how we form attitudes and stereotypes, social cognition, which is how we process social information,
Okay.
and group dynamics, how people behave in groups.
Right.
There's also growing interest in understanding unconscious social influences, those influences that we're not even aware of.
So like subtle cues and things like that.
Exactly. And how both individual characteristics and social context shape our behavior.
So it's both nature and nurture.
Yeah, it's really about understanding that interplay. And interestingly, Ideas from sociology, such as the roles we play in society and the impact of culture, have also influenced how social psychologists understand things like mental health.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah.
Then we have the psychoanalytic school, which, despite facing some criticism, has had a really profound impact on our understanding of the mind.
Yeah, psychoanalysis, primarily associated with Sigmund Freud, is a really comprehensive theory of personality and a set of therapeutic techniques.
Right. Freud, the father of psychoanalysis.
Exactly. And it focuses on the influence of unconscious mental processes on our thoughts, feelings, and behaviors.
So that idea that there's this whole world going on beneath the surface of our awareness.
Yeah, exactly. And Freud's ideas, which he developed through interpreting his patients' dreams, free associations, and early childhood experiences, were really revolutionary at the time. He proposed concepts like the ego and the superego, and he emphasized the importance of early life experiences in shaping our adult personality.
Right, those formative years.
Exactly. And Freud had a lot of followers and theorists who expanded on his original ideas.
So it wasn't just Freud himself.
No, not at all. Thinkers like Carl Jung, Alfred Adler, Erik Erikson, Melanie Klein, John Bowlby, and Anna Freud, among others, they built upon and sometimes diverged from Freud's original theories, leading to the development of various schools within psychoanalysis.
Okay, so it's like a whole family tree of psychoanalytic ideas.
Yeah, you could think of it that way. And while psychoanalysis has faced scientific scrutiny over the years, and its influence within academic psychology has somewhat lessened, it continues to be an important perspective in clinical practice, and it's had a lasting impact on our cultural understanding of the human mind.
Yeah, for sure. Like we still talk about, Freudian slips in the Oedipus complex.
Right. Those ideas have really permeated our culture.
Okay, so shifting to a more optimistic view, we have humanistic psychology. What's the central idea there?
So humanistic psychology emerged in the 1950s as a kind of third force in psychology.